Forbes Books presents The Great Digital Transformation with Gerard Zatvani, highlighting the pioneers that reimagined possibilities and reimagined businesses.
Gerry and I are happy to welcome David Rogers to the podcast. David is a member of the faculty at Columbia Business School, the author of 5 acclaimed books, including his newest, The Digital Transformation Roadmap, and is one of the world's leading experts on digital transformation, which is fitting for this podcast. He's worked closely with global companies like Google, Microsoft, and HSBC to successfully transform their businesses for the digital age. David is a sought-after keynote speaker and at Columbia teaches executives how to lead digital change through innovative programs. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, Gerry. It's a real pleasure to be with both of you and have a chance to talk today about an important topic that's dear to all our hearts.
Yeah, and it's funny you are a professional author because you have your book handy there just to show the video, just in case people don't believe us that you do have a book.
So, well, I've learned, the book is just coming into the world right now. I just got my own copies a few days ago, so very excited for everybody else to get their hands on it.
Well, congratulations. And I guess we want to dig deep into digital transformation, but I'm curious, since you've been teaching it for a while, just for my curiosity, when did that become something you taught in schools? Like, the idea of digital transformations was very nouveau in 2020 post-pandemic. But like, when did that become a thing people were learning actually in schools?
Yeah, so I've sort of been on a trajectory for a while here. Most of my teaching I've been at Columbia a little over 20 years, actually heading towards 25, Columbia Business School. But the last more than a decade, my teaching has all been really focused on our executive program. So I'm dealing with folks who are sort of senior leaders, mid-career, coming in for very short, intense programs with really bringing in a lot of experience of their own and looking at kind of what are the pressing issues on their plate. So let's look back about 13 years ago. I launched a program in our executive education division that was the first program with the word digital in it by any of our peer organizations, institutions. It was actually called digital marketing. And that's because that's what people thought digital was at that point. Businesses were like, digital, where does this go? Give it to the marketing people. I knew that was sort of a narrow view of what the impact was in terms of where digital technology was going. It was already clear, certainly by then, 2010. So it was interesting. I called the program Digital Marketing Strategy because I wanted to be clear this wasn't just sort of about tactics. It was more thinking about the customer differently. And in fact, what I saw was I would pull the room every time a new mix of international executives would show up, and only about half of them actually had marketing roles in their companies. Others were just like, well, this stuff is somehow really going to change my business. I need to figure it out. So over time, that sort of evolved. I developed programs what were called digital business strategy, sort of looking at how do we rethink some of the basic strategic principles that we've been teaching for decades in business schools around things like competition, value proposition, customer centricity, et cetera, and how do we have to think about that very differently in the digital era, programs on digital business leadership. At a certain point, I was working on a book about a decade ago I started writing, which was really trying to understand what is the most essential things that established businesses kind of already, these incumbents already in the world needed to do if they were going to start to catch up with this incredible acceleration of the digital era. And as I was researching it and writing and developing it, I was kind of looking around for a term to sort of capture this challenge that I was talking about and examining. And I sort of started to hear bubbling up on the periphery of kind of conferences and conversations, these 2 words, digital and transformation. So I said, okay, that seems kind of descriptive of everything I was writing about. So I put it in the title. My publisher was very happy because that was the first book ever written on digital transformation, using those words. So that was the transformation playbook. By the time that came out, that was 7 years ago. Books take a long time for me to write. And I've learned a lot since then. So it keeps shifting, Joe. And at this point, that book was all really about strategy and how do you reimagine where your business is going and kind of what its growth opportunity is and who your competitors are. But what I learned in the years since, in the last 7 years, is that even if you're able to make that tremendous kind of mindset shift to rethink your business, more and more I saw that the other equally and even more daunting kind of challenge was around transforming the organization. And that has become the focus of my work for the last 7 years, and which led to this book, is really understanding what are the organizational barriers to change that we have to work through that keep slowing down, keep impeding real meaningful change in established businesses. But the good news is there are things that can be done to address them.
That's so cool. So you are the godfather of digital transformation. I love that. And so, Gerry, I never asked you this. Did you ever take a class about digital? I know that's what you do for a living, Gerry, but have you ever taken a class, maybe seen David around Columbia or something? Like, how did you, what introduced you to that?
I wish I would. It would have made everything a little bit more streamlined and faster. But I had to do it the hard way, working on the ground.
Way, learning things yourself. That's how you learn the lessons the best.
Really, I think in my book, one of my chapters deals with digitization versus digital transformation. And I see a lot of confusion talking to my customers and people around me, that people sometimes think that just by putting a process, just converting it into a digital kind of a support, you would just do a digital transformation. And that's not it. That's really not it. It's, in my opinion, is looking around and understanding what are the opportunities that the new technology is giving you, and then also rethinking your business. What are the opportunities to improve my business around new features, new capabilities? Just think about video conferencing. Nowadays, with broadband video conferencing, this opens up the area of remote work like never before. And these are things that if you're not really taking this into account to kind of rethink your business and reimagine what can be possible, then that's really not digital transformation.
I love that example, Gerry, because it's something we can all experience in terms of, it's not about the technology, which isn't necessarily super sophisticated. It's about the impact and the value it's creating. The other thing about that example of video conferencing is it kind of points to exactly what I learned about organizations. So, Cisco, as an established incumbent, and networking of all kinds, saw this kind of emerging need, this emerging opportunity to create value through video conferencing. And they acquired, it was WebEx, and got themselves into that space and became, a significant player. And yet they fell into the trap, the organizational trap, which I see among others, which is so many companies struggle to pursue growth opportunities beyond what they perceive as their core business, right? Things that are just a little bit too far from, well, this is kind of what we're comfortable with, the products we already have, the kind of org chart we've set up, the go-to-market strategy we already know. So it wasn't that far out. It was their own employee, Eric Yuan, who came to them with the idea for Zoom. And he said, look, we're doing video conferencing, and I know why we've built it the way we have as kind of an enterprise product, because that's how Cisco operates. We run as a big Salesforce-driven, go-to-market. But what if we created something that was more lightweight, more interoperable, more just sort of consumer, like a consumer app? And he sketched it out, and he just couldn't get people inside the organization to listen to him. They're like, yeah, that's not our customer, right? That's not our focus. And so he eventually left. And I see this in a lot of organizations. It's not that they don't have people inside them who are able to identify that next opportunity, right? They had great opportunities already seized, but what's that next one emerging? There are typically people inside your organization who are already spotting them, right? Who are close enough to the customer to see what might be a good, new venture to pursue. It's the organizations aren't able to get out of their own way, to allocate resources, to figure out how to place small bets on a lot of different things, test them, shut most of them down, pick a couple that are showing validation in the market, scale them up super rapidly. That's where companies are breaking down. So that's what I've really been focused on, is how do we get past those organizational barriers, and how do we put in place the processes so that we can move, any business can move as fast at scale as a company like an Amazon or a Tesla or a Google.
I love irony, David, and the fact that you bring up a story of a company that transformed companies, yet they couldn't transform themselves. Like, is the irony lost in Cisco? Because obviously it's not lost on us here, but do they look at it and be like, hey, wait a minute, we transform companies, why can't we do it ourselves?
Yeah. It's not a problem of sort of, bad management. A lot of people think, it's our industry is slow or backward, or it's, the people at the top don't get it. It's actually, these are structural problems. If you look at established organizations, once you get to a certain size and scale, there are structural reasons why, by default, resources will be allocated to where money is currently being made. People will pick the path where they have a clear career path and they know, well, I could start that new interesting thing, but I have no idea, where that's going to take me, and I could burn my bridges and kill my career. Whereas I've got this nice steady path I can go on. These incentives that are in place, all these things are kind of built into structures inside companies as they get bigger and bigger and more established. And so we just have to be cognizant of it and figure out, how do we rewire some of these processes, some of these rules and kind of operating procedures in companies that allow us to be much more nimble, much more agile, and really pursue a lot of new digital growth opportunities.
Well, I'm talking about this thing in my book, is that generally bigger organizations are really good in doing incremental improvements.
Yep.
Not so good about reimagining themselves. How would you reinvent your business if you don't have to worry about P&L, if you don't have to think about budgets, if you don't have to think about go-to-market? Let's remove all the obstacles and let's sit down and dream a little bit. Like it's kind of a dreaming exercise. Okay, what would it be? Is this something that might be interesting or not?
Yeah.
And I often see that a good way of innovating is having like a special dedicated unit that you either acquire it or you set it up as an intrapreneurial organization that really works on these initiatives, and kind of like a skunks work group. And some companies have it, some companies don't, and you can tell the difference.
I definitely agree, Gerry. I guess what I have learned is, what I've sort of evolved towards over time is the realization that established companies, need to sort of think about three parallel paths to growth. We usually think about two. There's been a lot of kind of academic research and writing on ambidextrous organizations. But really what I've seen, the companies who are succeeding have kind of three different ways that they're trying to drive growth. The first is exactly as you mentioned, kind of what's easiest for established companies, incremental innovation improvement in the core business. And that's critical, right? Every business has got to keep doing that. The second, though, is what I call the second path, is innovation that relates to your core business, but has a lot of uncertainty around it. So these are not really incremental innovations. This is like you are the New York Times and you're saying, how do we rethink journalism? How do we rethink the way we tell stories now that we're in a digital medium? And so we can bring in data and visualizations, and it's not, the article isn't written once and done. And we have all sorts of new sort of tools at our disposal. It's, if you're a bank, how do we rethink the way we interact with our customer now that it's no longer, a teller or an ATM? Well, it's a mobile app. We've got to connect data across all these different touch points. Is it a human interface or is it an AI-driven, interface? And when do we sort of blend those two? These things are not kind of incremental improvements, right? And again, if you take that kind of classic sort of functional siloed kind of management process, you're not going to do well. So you need sort of a hybrid. Exactly as Gerry said, you need to have kind of specialized teams, but those teams need to be embedded or sort of hybrid teams with the core business itself, because they're solving a problem for the core. If they just go off and work on a great new customer experience for the bank, I guarantee they will bring it back and it will be rejected. It never works if you do that independently. So you need these kind of hybrid teams that are partnering with the core business, but bringing in the sort of skill sets around, agile software development, small multifunctional teams, rapid testing and iterative learning with customers, et cetera. And then the third path is that, classic path of sort of growth beyond the core. So this is the teams that are saying, we're going to go after some totally new or an opportunity that either has like a different customer you're trying to service who you haven't served before, so you don't know them well, or maybe it requires different capabilities than you currently have, or it's got maybe a very different go-to-market and different revenue model than your current business. So it's quite unfamiliar, but it's also something you actually can sort of break off because it's sort of divorced enough from the core, and you really can give a dedicated team room to run with it. They don't have to stay in like tight sync with this, the moving train, so to speak, and they can go build that thing on an island almost, the way that, Amazon started Amazon Web Services. Literally, Chris Pinkham, one of the first teams that built one of the first three products, he was literally sent to South Africa, right? About as far from Seattle as you can go build that first product, come back when it's ready. So that's the third path. And each of these can be managed. It's just that each path has to be managed differently. And that's one of the key things I've learned in my experience is companies have to set up really sort of different processes, different metrics, different people, different resourcing for managing, again, incremental growth in the core, highly uncertain growth that is tied up in the core business, so you can't do it without them, and then highly uncertain growth that is far from the core in a totally new sort of innovation space.
This last example that you're talking about is what Zoom would have been for Cisco if they would have just created a unit and sent
Yeah,
send it
they could
somewhere
have just
to
said,
South
okay,
Africa or
Eric,
whatever.
yeah, this is a totally different customer base. We don't know how to sell to them. We don't know how to price for them. Why don't you take a small team, build an MVP, see what you can get to market in 12 months, have a board that's checking in, giving them sort of iterative tranches of funding, just like a VC board would do. That would have been the approach. And he would have, obviously he would have built it because he did. Right? When he was on his own, he was on the right direction, and he had those kind of entrepreneur instincts to really kind of stay close to the customer and test and evolve it. So yeah, it was a great opportunity.
And we've been discussing lately, David, on the podcast, is sort of the shift of, when we started it was all about digital transformation, but now it's all about true business transformation, like the entire soup to nuts, as what you've been talking about. Do you have any examples of novel use in tech to reimagine businesses and do this true business transformation, not just digital, but almost like from mindset, from the top down or bottom up, what have you? Any good examples of that, David?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, to me, that's what digital transformation has to be. I mean, I'm not saying that companies have to assume that within their, right out the gate, they're going to reinvent their business model. But that has to be, to me, that is, digital transformation, I define this way. It is transforming an established business to thrive in a world of constant digital change, right? So that kind of means three things. First, it's not about technology. It's about the customer. It's about the business. It's about creating business value for customers. Second, it's about an established organization, right? This is inherently the challenge. You already have people and products and org charts and distribution partners and sales channels and a brand reputation. All these things are already in place. And so you have to navigate that, right? You can't just imagine you're in a kind of a starting from a blank slate. And then the third is that this is an ongoing journey, right? It's not a project. It doesn't have a start date and an end date. You have to get better at continuously changing and adapting because the digital change in the environment is not slowing down. So you asked for some examples. New York Times is certainly one that I point to. They're a great learning case because they sort of did everything wrong for about a decade before they finally realized they were just kind of at war with themselves culturally inside the organization, and all these digital efforts were not really adding up to a difference to their business as it was just crashing and the revenue was going down year over year over year. And then they really turned the corner and started to really rethink their culture, change their culture, get a really clear vision of what they needed to do to reinvent the business. So for them, like a lot of media companies, that meant shifting from an advertising business model as the primary source of revenue, right? They still have advertising, but that had been for like 100 years their primary revenue source. And finally they woke up and said, look, this is not about delivering the same old articles through new golly gee whiz, bang digital, media. That's what they thought for 10 years. It's all, we'll just try out virtual reality and blogs and chats. And it's all just, a new way to deliver the same content. They realized they actually had to flip the business model from being primarily ad revenue with a little bit of subscription revenue to being primarily subscription business with some supplemental support from ad revenue. And that required them to change everything about the business. And it's been really remarkable once they got that clarity of the transformation they needed to make, how quickly it started to happen. And now they're seen as kind of a best-in-class business. Another one, from finance, just as an example, a company sort of on that journey today, MasterCard, they have their legacy core business, which is, of course, still there as a credit card network. That's a really important part of their revenue today. But they have really expanded their viewpoint to what we were talking about before. They are not defining themselves as a credit card network. They define themselves as the world's biggest fintech company. And the sort of mission, the problem they're trying to solve is much broader. They're focused on really powering secure commerce in the digital era across every device and platform. So that means a lot of different kinds of transactions in commerce, a very different approach to data. It means expanding their ecosystem even farther to include lots of fintech startups who they partner with in various fashions. And it means they're going after opportunities to create value in areas like digital identity authentication, right? Because that's critical to secure commerce, but doing all kinds of really innovative things around biometrics and data and machine learning to try to sort of, how do we predict and identify what's a malevolent threat or an impersonation, and what's the real person who is being presented to us. So a company that's really sort of shifted their scope and their vision of what are we here to do, what is our kind of our place and our value to the market, and using that to really go after a lot of really exciting new ventures at scale.
What I find very interesting and very inspiring is that some companies they embrace technology with all its possibilities, and by putting the customer in the center, they I think they ramped up personalization a lot, because traditionally the way it was in the consumer market, you would manufacture a widget and then you would sell it to someone, and if that happened to be what the customer wanted, well, so be it. Nowadays, you can personalize everything. You can adapt, change, personalize. You can even 3D print something that is very unique for yourself. So that and some companies embrace this kind of on-demand manufacturing model and personalization at an extent that is really inspiring.
It's a great opportunity. I see, I wrote a book 12 years ago. It came out called The Network is Your Customer, trying to understand what are the kind of core behaviors of customers and their kind of behavioral needs in the digital era, that basic human needs, but that digital technology is sort of amplifying and bringing to the core, and using that to think about designing new, product, services, customer experiences. And customize is one of the 5 behaviors that I saw time and again across different industries that customers have this desire to do, to customize experiences, to have things that are more tailored, specific to them. So I couldn't agree more. And I think it applies to, B2B and industrial cases. It's not just about sort of consumer services. People always want, and increasingly we have the power to deliver at scale, and offering an interaction, a service delivery model that is more specific to their needs, and not just sort of, well, here's kind of the mean average customer, what they would like, and take it or leave it.
It's funny, David, because the first bucket of the 3 things you were breaking down before was customer, and Gerry is a big fan of making sure you're customer centric, and he kind of delved into it a little bit there. But why do companies forget the most important thing, the customer?
So this is an important problem I've been looking at for some time, is why is it exactly? And I would argue that as companies succeed, over time, they become less and less focused on the customer. That's the natural inclination you have to fight against. Not all companies fall into that trap, but there's sort of a gravitational pull. And, this was written about decades ago by Ted Levitt in his famous article, Marketing Myopia. And he really talked about how over time success, causes a company to, their vision of the future becomes defined by the products of their past, because they're like, oh, this is what we do. We're so good at it. Right? And that's what happened to the New York Times. Like, they'd been this sort of esteemed newspaper for over a century, and they thought, well, we just have to do things in the Times way. They even invented an adjective, Timesian. Well, is that the Timesian way of doing things? And they didn't realize that, they were successful because they had met the needs of the market, not because they had sort of stuck to some tradition in the past. Ted Levitt in his article talks about kind of industry after industry, how the difference over time in times of change, the difference between the winners and the losers were the incumbents who focused on the products that they had been making, versus those who focused on the customer needs that they have been serving, and thinking about, okay, how are those needs evolving? I'd point out a couple more things I found in my research beyond that sort of, natural narrowing of vision. Organizational structures, right? So even with well-meaning people, you set up organizational structures around the kind of products and services that you're currently delivering, and therefore sort of resources kind of follow from that, right? Resources are allocated based on, the division or the product or line of business that's generating money today. That's who gets more money to spend. Versus what if there's an opportunity to solve a new customer problem? Well, who's going to take care of that, right? Metrics tend to be misaligned. And of course, as organizations become larger and more complex, the old way that we managed companies was from a very top-down sort of approach. And part of that was using metrics primarily as a tool of control. I believe metrics are incredibly important, but they are primarily powerful as a tool of alignment. And instead, it was thought, well, somebody up top is going to sort of keep an eye on your numbers and make sure you're doing what we want you to do. And so metrics are always, traditionally backward-looking. Again, you've built certain things, they've worked well. You have metrics designed to optimize the business of the past, right? That is what happens. And so that discourages people from pursuing these new customer needs, even again, when the employees, it tends to not be that employees are somehow blind, right? They recognize them, but the metrics sort of point them away from it. Two more issues. One is we tend to see customer focus is a double-edged sword, right? So we tell companies to be customer focused, but inevitably that means you'll be focused on your current customers, which is great and important. But if there's an opportunity to reach a new customer, that actually becomes a very large barrier. This is something Clay Christensen, of course, famously wrote about in The Innovator's Dilemma, is that established businesses become so focused on the needs of the customers they currently have that when a new opportunity emerges, if their current customers don't care about it or don't care about it yet, right? Typically, if it's a new opportunity, the early adopters, at least, are going to be someone else. Eventually, your current customers will discover they want that too. But the first customers are going to be someone else. And you say, oh, that's not our customer. Well, that's exactly what Cisco did. They said, oh, Eric Yuan's idea for Zoom, that's not our customer. Our customers are these big enterprises. They're not asking for that, right? They want a new version of WebEx. And then the last is, in many cases, you see a barrier that comes from cannibalization. And this is whether it's genuine or a perception. People inside the organization perceive that, well, yes, there's that customer need. Sure, customers want to, for example, stream our content rather than watch it over linear television. This is all the media companies, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, as Netflix was proving the demand for streaming. And they said, yeah, we can see the customer wants that, but that seems like that's going to cut against our current business. It's going to hurt our profits. And so it's extremely hard unless you actually have mechanisms set up to allocate resources towards those kinds of threats, those kinds of opportunities that are also threats to your current core business. That becomes yet another barrier to really following that customer need through to its logical conclusion and building something to serve it.
Not realizing where the market demand is and how the things evolve with your customer and potential customers can be something life-threatening. Like look today in the car industry. Just had a listing on the stock exchange. WinFast, a company that is manufacturing electricals in Vietnam, had a market capitalization that is bigger than General Motors or Ford, or I'm not even talking about Tesla, that is several times bigger. But it's like they just listed. Like for me, this is, and why is this value where it is? It is because they are in a market that is a fast-growing market, that is what the users want more and more and more. And for a company not understanding that the ground is really shifting below them is life-threatening. I think it's in some cases can be they're becoming irrelevant.
Exactly. It's a question of relevance, and no company can afford to be irrelevant to its customers. It doesn't matter how big you are.
This is this entire AI revolution that is coming now. You have industries like copywriting, like software. My industry, a lot of software services. You have these areas that will be heavily impacted, and if companies are not embracing and are not moving ahead with it, then it can be life-threatening.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we have seen. The historical record has shown is that if you are an established business and a new technology brings a capability that could create value for the customer, and you choose not to, you say, we're going to wait and see a little bit because we're not nervous or we're concerned how this is going to impact our bottom line. Someone else is going to seize that opportunity very quickly, and you're going to find it almost impossible to catch up with them if you let them go there first. So it's critical.
And let's talk about your book, because you held it up at the beginning and I feel like we forgot about it here for a second, David. But Gerry brings up AI. I'm going to guess there's some sort of AI chapter in there, right, David?
No, there's not a chapter on AI. The book is not organized around technology. And this is a key point. Digital transformation is not in service of technology. Technology is in service of the business transformation. There's really two things you have to do. For digital transformation, I think of it as a formula. Digital transformation equals digital strategy plus organizational transformation. Right? And that's what the last book and this book have focused on. Now, of course, every single example throughout the entire book is about technology, using digital technologies, including AI of various kinds. So it's not that it's all about, but the way that you use AI is you don't fall in love with the solution first, right? You don't say, oh my gosh, we've got to come up with a ChatGPT strategy, right? That's not strategic thinking. You start with thinking about what are the problems we're going to solve? What are the, who's the customer who has that problem? Why do we have a unique right to win? Why are we better positioned than others maybe to solve that? So to Gerry's point, we're a content production, we're a creative agency, and like copywriting is changing in the world today. So not starting like, well, let's just throw some Gen AI at everything, right? That's a great way to produce a lot of content really rapidly that's really terrible. That's what we've learned in the last 6 months. It's sort of impressive that a computer made it, or we've been impressed. I think in a couple more months, we won't even be impressed by that anymore because our kind of expectations move very quickly. But it's not really what you'd want to do, be your actual final draft of your marketing campaign. It's an incredibly powerful tool. So you need to say, what problem am I going to solve? So as a copywriter, maybe this is going to allow me to do massively much more customized versions of every single campaign. I'm going to create a campaign, and rather than saying, hey, here's the one messaging we've got, instead we're going to have 5,000 variations on it. And we're going to use AI then to test those in the market and quickly whittle it down to, 100 or so that tend to outperform with various segments. And then we're going to rapidly develop, the AI will develop models for segmenting and figuring out which variation to use in which context with which customer, right? So it's all about looking for problems to solve, knowing the problems you're solving, who the customer is, what the market needs are, and then figuring out how do we use these incredible capabilities that keep emerging and figure out how do we don't just take it for granted, but experiment, test, validate, see what works, what doesn't. Of course, there's all sorts of questions with this latest wave of AI, the generative AI, about reliability, right? That's one of the biggest sort of business hurdles, is that is factually unreliable. It tends to hallucinate. So that has a huge impact on how you apply it. So you've got to figure out, where does that matter? Where does it hurt us? Where is it not necessarily issue? I think we're going to see generative AI built into every single sort of what I would call a creator tool. I mean, starting with like Microsoft Word. I'm not talking about high-end people who think of themselves as designers, but any tool that we use to, write code, to write paragraphs, to, send emails, any tool where we are creating things as a human, we're going to have generative AI baked into those tools within, 12 months. Many of them are already starting to do so. And the question is, how do we do this in a way that improves, becomes a great tool in the tool belt of all of our staff, our people? It allows them to work faster and better and much more personalized, to go back to a point that Gerry made earlier about the demand for customization. That's the kind of thing we should be doing. And that smart companies are doing with generative AI.
And I want to get both of your opinions on this. I'm old enough to remember the metaverse. I don't know if you guys remember that.
Yeah.
You remember
back
that?
in 2022?
Yeah, 22. And so I want to know, starting with you, David, like, why did the metaverse not pop, but AI popped? Is there, because, technology comes in waves, as you know, you've been teaching it and writing about it for decades. Why did metaverse not work?
So the simple answer is there was no metaverse. It was just a hype term, right? It was just sort of something, it was an empty vessel that people could sort of put whatever they wanted their meaning into it. If you say, okay, yeah, but many people sort of, what was the common thread? It seemed to be, at least to the companies spending a lot of money, most notably, of course, Meta. It was like, okay, AR, VR, some kind of immersive experience. So the difference here is we don't have the technology, right? We never had the technology. It was just like talking up, oh, once we build the technology, this is going to transform the world, right? I mean, we had a version of the technology, but it was not one that was good enough that people wanted to, spend time in a metaverse with it. And so you had this, incredibly low adoption. I mean, relatively, certainly no mass market of adoption. I mean, I think, the biggest spender on this, again, Meta, who has billions of people in its customer base, was able to get into their, a marquee property, their, version of the metaverse, Horizon Worlds. I think it was like 200,000 users. I mean, that's basically the same number of people who are currently using Second Life, which is a version of the metaverse that was built like 20 years ago, or well over a decade. So the technology wasn't there. And the reason why people are excited about generative AI is because there is something really different in incredible new capabilities. Again, that's not enough. We need to harness this for business use and to create value in the market. But there's no question there's been this tremendous leap forward in the technology, and it's something that is relatively scalable, right? It's not zero cost. There's a reason why you have to pay for, the full version of ChatGPT and so forth. We're not quite like Google search or something, but it is relatively scalable. It can be adopted. A lot of it has been open sourced, so it can be used in a lot of contexts to start playing around with it. And it really is, these large language models are a significant advance in capabilities that is real. It's got serious questions around it and sort of constraints and downsides, and as most new technologies do. So that's why it's still a lot of open questions about the best applications and the most, safest and most useful and most reliable, but it's a totally different story.
I think that the big difference is that with ChatGPT, you had some immediate use cases that gave you immediate value, such as writing an essay for your exam. That's immediate, instant, and that's what made a huge difference. With Meta, you kind of try to figure out maybe there is some value somewhere that
it's like probably people talk about Web3. It's all kind of theory, and somewhere this is going to be revolutionary. Yeah, exactly.
Just playing around with technology, but not really having a clear use case that can be applied to.
Could we call Web3 and even the I guess more the metaverse like a scam? Like I get like Elizabeth Holmes vibes here, because you had all these companies. I know Disney.
I don't know. Zuckerberg's been scamming himself. I wouldn't quite say that. I mean,
no, but you look at like a Disney. They started a meta department. They hired people, and all of a sudden they quietly went ahead and sunsetted that. Like you said, it was just more like all theoretical. I'm using scams kind of harshly, but
it's the hype cycle. I mean, I think there's a distinction, it's a gradation, but between the sort of technology hype cycle and the venture capital hype cycle, and sort of, Silicon Valley's, kind of bubble, versus out and out actual, fraud, where you're literally misrepresenting what is the product right now. You're selling vaporware as if it was real. And taking people's money on fraudulent presentations of the current state of the technology. I mean, that's obviously one thing can be a slippery slope to the other, but I would make a distinction there. But yeah, it's, I don't know, mass delusion maybe, at least within a certain group.
And sometimes it's just a very thin line between being visionary and just being a fake, because many of these things that have been imagined by Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or whatever, you could have said, not going to go anywhere, but they actually were able to make it work.
I would make a distinction, though, like Apple is certainly a strong case of that they're a company that really tries to push the envelope, but they don't go out and start talking about of course they hype it over, the Apple Watch was going to transform everything about your life. And it took about 5 years before we really figured out why we wear them. They'll talk things up a bit, but they wait till they have a product, right? They don't start the hype cycle when they're like still in the testing. They are very, very, very quiet when they're spending years trying to build something that they think is actually ready to use at least in one or two use cases with a real customer in the market. And then they'll roll out a very rough, very early, very lean, slim, first what I would call a functional MVP, something you can really use in your life or your business place. And there's a lot still to be built, but they do have the discipline. They wait till they have something you can genuinely use for some useful purpose. And then they roll that out and start saying about how revolutionary it is. So there's a bit of a distinction between, that and this, the metaverse hype trade.
All right, awesome. Well, let's wrap this up, David. We're talking about who the digital transformation roadmap is for.
So this book is really for anyone in an established business. And this is the thing that I was surprised to discover was as I started looking at the kind of transformation that's necessary in companies today, and I found companies coming to me for help who were not these kind of old legacy dinosaur companies that were 20 years old, 15 years old. I was like, well, wait, you're digital native, right? Yeah, it doesn't matter. Like we started when the web was established and like smartphones were coming online. Everything, there's been so much change since then. So the challenge is really any established business that's looking to figure out how do we keep up with this pace of change? How do we get good at being agile, learning, testing, building new things, solving new customer problems, and doing that at scale as we hopefully, if we're successful, get bigger and bigger, or maybe you already are a large, complex organization. Because if you don't learn these lessons of how do you bake those kind of skills for adaptability into your organization, then the bigger you get, the harder it is going to be to change. And you're going to be sort of trapped in the inertia of your own success. But I would stress this book is written for people at every level of the organization. Because one of the key lessons I discovered in researching and learning on the way to writing it is that digital transformation cannot happen, cannot succeed if it is only from the top down. If it's a chief digital officer, the CEO or someone else who comes in and says, okay, we're going to figure out the plan, and then we're going to tell people what they need to do in the various parts of the company. Leadership needs to lay out the case for why we need to change, how our world for our particular business is changing, right? Where is our industry, our customer, our market going? What are we uniquely good at, right? What's our right to win in this digital future? And what are a few problems, what I call picking the problems that matter most, right? What are those customer problems we're going to solve, those market needs that we are really going to stand out, and we're going to really focus on those to the exclusion of a lot of other interesting kind of avenues of digital, investment and products that we could pursue. That's what leaders do. And then they let every division, every team at every level of the organization actually come up with the ideas, translate, well, what does that mean for our marketing division? What does that mean for the sales team in Southeast Asia? What does that mean for the new product development research team in Sao Paulo, right? Everybody's got to figure out what does this mean in our part of the organization? How are we carrying this organization, this business forward towards that clear strategy, that vision of where we're headed? So every chapter of this book, each step, there are 5 steps in the roadmap, is designed to be implemented because it has to be implemented at every single level of the organization.
Awesome. Well, David, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. Really appreciate it. And if folks wanted to reach out to you, find out more about you, where should they look, David?
Absolutely. They can find me on my website, which is davidrogers.digital. So not the usual domain .com, .net, et cetera. It's .digital. And if you go there, you can sign up for my newsletter. I have a Substack newsletter that I publish every week. It's free. Has a lot of commentary writing on these sorts of topics. You also, if you sign up, you'll automatically get a download of the first chapter of the new book, The Digital Transformation Roadmap. But if you sound like the kind of person who this would be relevant to, I of course want to encourage folks. It's on Amazon, and every day it's on more booksellers, but it's already there to order, Kindle and hardcover, and I hope you'll check it out.
Well, David, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, Gerry.
This has been The Great Digital Transformation with Gerard Zatvani. To participate in the conversation, go to gerardzatvani.com. The Great Digital Transformation is a production of Forbes Books.